This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture. My name is Hiram Maxim. I'm the Faculty Director of the Emory College Language Center. And before I turn things over to my colleague Don Tooten to introduce our today's speaker, Claire Crumpsch, I want to let you know about a few other events that the Language Center is organizing this semester. 2 weeks from today, we have Alana Shouhami, a professor of education from the Tel Aviv University, who will be presenting on her research on linguistic landscape. The following week, on February 18th, Lara Boroditsky, a cognitive linguist from UC San Diego, will be presenting on her research on how language affects thought. Both those talks will be at 4 o'clock. And then the final lecture of this semester is March 27th, when Barbara Johnstone, professor of English and linguistics at Carnegie Mellon, will be presenting on her research on discourse analysis, particularly her work with Pittsburghese. That will be at 4:15, and I believe all 3 talks, as well as today, are in this room. So, for more information, feel free to check the Language Center website. That's at languagecenter.emory.edu. Okay. So I also want to give special thanks to 2 key people in the Language Center, Jose Luis Borges, the Associate Director of the Language Center, and Sarah Short, the Programming Coordinator, who have been instrumental in helping organize these events. But now we can turn our attention to today's speaker, Claire Crumpsch. When Don approached me about inviting Claire to come talk at Emory and to be part of some ongoing conversations both within his department and language studies departments in general, I naturally would jump to the idea. More than happy to have the ECLC, the Language Center, get behind this visit. I'll let Don explain in more detail why this is such a special visit for Emory. But I just wanted to say a few things from my own perspective, why I'm overjoyed to have Claire here on campus. Personally, Claire has had a profound effect in my own career, dating back to a 5-week summer seminar I took with her at Berkeley in 1995, when she opened my at the time, very green eyes to new ways of thinking about language, education, and literacy. And I think it's fair to say that there's not much in my career that hasn't been affected by her work, so I'm really grateful that she can come here and speak to you today. And as a quick little side note, as the director of the Language Center, I should quickly note that the Berkeley Language Center that Claire founded upon her arrival at Berkeley served as one of the primary models for our own Language Center. So yet another example of her deep influence she's had in the language studies profession. But before I get sentimental and carried away, I better turn the floor over to Don, and who will introduce formally Claire.
You're getting a double introduction because Claire Crumpsch only comes once every 14 years to Emory, so we have to take advantage. Welcome, of course. I would like to begin with 3 ritual acts of thanking, though no less sincere for being ritualistic. First, we must thank the numerous sponsors of this event, on behalf of whom I'm speaking now. These include the Hightower Fund, the Stipe Fund of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the Emory College Language Center, the Program in Linguistics, and the Departments of Russian and East Asian Languages and Cultures, Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies, French and Italian, and Classics. You can see interest is widespread. I'd also like to thank Sarah Short again for her help in putting this together. And, of course, we need to thank all of you who are here today, particularly those colleagues from nearby colleges and universities who have perhaps suffered some temporal or geographical inconvenience to be here today. And most importantly, of course, we would like to thank Professor Claire Crumpsch, for kindly accepting our invitation to return to Emory in Atlanta and speak to us today. As most of you well know, Claire Crumpsch is professor of German and education at the University of California, Berkeley, where she has taught since 1990. Working within and across the fields of second language acquisition, applied linguistics, discourse analysis, social and cultural theory, and multilingualism, she has sought in her scholarly work to help us reimagine what it means to learn, experience, and teach second and foreign languages. The importance of her work can be demonstrated quantitatively. She is author or co-author of well over 150 articles and book chapters, author or editor of more than 10 books, and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Goethe Medal, the Distinguished Scholarship and Service Award from the American Association for Applied Linguistics, the Modern Language Association Distinguished Service Award, and the MLA Kenneth Mildenberger Award for Outstanding Research in the Study of Foreign Languages and Literatures, which she received for her 1993 book, Context and Culture in Language Teaching. I'm still attached to print text. As well as her more recent 2009 book, The Multilingual Subject. But such lists, as impressive as they are, I don't think really capture the inspirational power that many of us perceive in her work. So veering off script a bit, I would like to borrow, recontextualize, and reaccentuate some well-known words of the poet and musician Leonard Cohen. Ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything, that's how the light gets in. Now, I know it may seem odd for me to be quoting Leonard Cohen while introducing Claire Crampsch. Let me explain. First, in an age in which figures such as Larry Summers shamelessly endorse the notion of monolingual internationalism, Claire Crampsch has spoken eloquently in the US and across the world of the increasing imperative to study and teach second and foreign languages. But at the same time, she has asked us to reconsider many of our basic assumptions about what it means to do this. For instance, in her celebrated PMLA essay, The Privilege of the Non-Native Speaker, and in her book, The Multilingual Subject, she asks us to consider language learners not as persons who almost inevitably produce broken, cracked, imperfect reflections of monolingual native speaker norms, but rather signifying embodied subjects in process who can be transformed and gain symbolic power through their access to multiple systems of signification. On the other hand, she also asks us to recognize and reflect on the cracks in what we might view as perfect and complete. For instance, she has long asked us to reconsider how we organize our professional activities and to move beyond simple and hierarchical dichotomies between language teaching and study of literature, or perhaps between literature and linguistics. But even when we accept the challenges she presents us with, she also warns us not to become too complacent, those perfect offerings. Not to imagine that there is a way or the way to imagine the study and teaching of languages and cultures. It is precisely for these reasons that we've asked her to come speak to us today. As we all respond to the ongoing crisis in higher education in the world, we have an opportunity to reimagine and thereby reinvigorate what we are doing and why we are doing it. One of those ways is to view our collective professional activities as scholars, teachers, and students of language and culture as different facets of the study of discourse. Today, Claire Crampsch will be speaking to us on critical discourse analysis in foreign language study in an age of multilingualism. Please join me in welcoming her back to Emory.
Thank you, Max and Dan, for those very generous and personal introductions. I'm very moved, and I'm very happy to be back here after, I didn't know it was 14 years, boy. So we're going to be talking about critical discourse analysis in foreign language study in an age of multilingualism. That long title has really two aspects that I'll be addressing. One is the end of the second half of that title, Foreign Language Study in an Age of Multilingualism, which will deal with the changed landscape of our profession in an age that some have called post-nationalistic. Now, we're not really post-nationalistic, but at least the national boundaries or the national ways of thinking about languages, cultures, etc., has given way to more global, international ways of thinking about it, which poses some real challenges to the way we're doing business as foreign language teachers, meaning as teachers of standard national languages. So that's the first half, the first aspect of my talk. The second one is, what does discourse analysis and the critical kind of discourse analysis, how does it enable us as researchers to get a handle on that changed landscape of foreign language study? So despite the vagaries of this microphone, I'm going to address both aspects of this problem. So here's my outline. I will allow myself to be a little personal in an introduction and how I personally got to discover discourse analysis. Then I will engage you in a few theoretical considerations of what do we mean by discourse, what do we mean by critical discourse analysis, in particular that aspect of the textbook genre, because ultimately I will report on a study that I did on textbooks teaching German in the United States and in Germany. I will look at the textbook genre, and I will see in particular how critical discourse analysis can implement the goals of the Modern Language Association report of 2007 to develop historical and political consciousness. I hope you hear me without too many interruptions. Then I will delve in my study, which is the discourse of history in German language textbooks. And that will be a discourse study of these two textbooks that hopefully will yield some insights into how we are to conceive of raising historical and political consciousness in foreign language classes. And then in the end, I will reflect on the approach chosen and how that still jives with our understanding of now teaching foreign languages in an age of multilingualism. So the first part of my talk will be rather theoretical, and then the second part will be more data-driven. So how did I come? Me as French, French-born, French-educated, French everything, before I came to this country. How did I get onto discourse analysis after being trained in German language and literature at the Sorbonne, École Normale, and in the French educational system? I was not at all prepared to consider language under its discourse dimensions. I came to discourse analysis while teaching German to undergraduates at MIT, where I was for 25 years before I came to Berkeley. And at MIT, I was despairing to ever understand my undergraduate students who had weird ways of looking at the world, of understanding themselves and the world that I was not at all prepared to face, nor did they understand me, a French person teaching German in the United States. There were so many aspects that we did not understand of one another that I was in a mood for inquiry and exploration of other fields than Goethe and Schiller, who were not giving me answers to my existential crisis at the time. Then all of a sudden I discovered on the shelf of Widener Library in Harvard, totally by serendipity, a book by Hugo Steger, Texte gesprochener deutscher Standardsprache, which was a discourse analysis of Hugo Steger, the sociolinguist in Germany, on how language looks when it is transcribed according to the rules of conversation analysis. I was absolutely stunned. For years I'd been teaching conversational courses in conversation and teaching how to explain texts. And I didn't know what a conversation was, and I didn't know what a text was. And here was, in Hugo Steger, the real language as it is spoken in everyday life on radio talk shows. And that launched me then into the field, and I started reading everything I could put my hands on, starting, of course, with Sinclair and Coulthard in 1975, their analysis of classroom interaction. Coulthard, then Henry Widdowson, of course, on discourse. Diane Larson Freeman, then in the 80s. I myself contributed to that conversation through 3 books in 1981, 84, and 85 in the 3 languages that I knew at the time. Then going on to the application application of discourse analysis to the analysis of literary texts through Fowler, 1986. I then went on to discover on my own critical discourse analysis with Norman Fairclough in 1989, 2001, then contributed some more while I was at Cornell with Sally McConnell-Jeanette, and then my context and culture in the 90s. Then finding confirmation how important discourse was as the bridge between language and literature in Guy Cook, 1994, and then Barbara Johnstone, who then in 2002 gave us this wonderful book of discourse analysis that I use still to this day with my undergraduates. That's only as introduction of how somebody who was steeped in literature and steeped in philology at the time got to discover discourse analysis as the royal road that brings us together in a living language, the language that lives in speakers, writers, listeners, and readers. And that was a momentous epiphany for me, who had been studying language as a bunch of linguistic structures on the page or inside grammars. I won't spend more time in that because I want to just wrap up for you who are interested in discourse. At some point in my course on discourse analysis, I have gathered some definitions of what is discourse. So I'm going to run you quickly through 10 definitions of one way of looking at discourse. These are, in fact, definitions, as you can see all from the references. In the 80s and early 90s, discourse was seen by applied linguists mostly in its structural sense. Discourse is, in fact, how language is used beyond the sentence level. Here you have in definition 1. In definition 2, larger units of language, such as paragraphs, conversations, and interviews. This was a more, indeed, formal, structural view of what discourse is. Michael Stubbs is, in definition 3, is the linguistic analysis of connected spoken and written language. So you have the idea that it is a coherent, cohesive piece of language. Then number 4 adds from Michael Canala to this definition the notion that these are spoken or written texts in different genres. So here you have the word genre that is added to the mix of what discourse is. It is beyond the sentence, incoherent, cohesive, hanging together texts in particular genres. And then number 5 adds the notion of acts of communication, which brings in speech acts and the whole pragmatics of communication. Then the next 5 definitions given in the 90s and the late 80s is basically variations on this theme that we're dealing with language as communication. Number 8, here we have discourse coherence by Guy Cook. Then we have in number 9 the relationship of language and context. So you have here a definition of discourse as text and context. And in number 10, you have the added dimension of meaning. So discourse is really the way we make meaning in different modalities and the way we create, relate, organize, and realize meaning. So these first 10 definitions are how we create meaning, but on the formal level, on the textual level, on the communication level. You're going to see that then now, starting in the 90s and the late 90s, we're moving into a definition of discourse that encompasses many more dimensions of the context. So we have here in number 11, the discourse is not something that language does. Discourse is, to put it crudely, the condition by which language as a structure of a system exists. That sounds already like Foucault, which is very inspired by. Namely, these are the conditions of possibility that enable us to make meaning or to make the meanings that we intend to make. So we're already getting into the political, the historical, the social and cultural context of possibility of making meaning. Then number 12 harks in that same direction. The issue in discourse analysis is why at a given time, out of all the possible things that could be said, only certain things were said. As you can see, we're moving into a much more philosophical view of what discourse is. Then with Fairclough of course, in number 13, we have discourse is social practice. So it's not just something that we can ascertain by looking at texts. We have to look at the give and take of listeners and speakers and writers and readers in dialogue, in conversation with one another. Then we have Ross Ivanich writing about writing and identity in number 14. This is, in fact, a way of discourse is a way of representing a particular aspect of reality from a particular ideological perspective. So you have here, entering the notion of discourse, the notion that discourses are floating ideologies that we respond to or that we mouth ourselves as we speak and as we write. It is even more accentuated by Günter Kress's definition in 15. Discourses are systems of meaning embedded in certain institutions. So there you have the notion of power entering the notion of discourse. Because discourse enters into the exchange of reality and creation of reality through institutions, which in turn are determined by ideologies in response to larger social structures. And this kind of definition is continued by the fact that language, or as discourse, is definitely associated with ways of thinking, not only ways of speaking. And that is the object of Alan Luke's definition in number 16. So we're dealing here with discourse not just as ways of speaking or of writing, but of thinking, and the indissociable notion of thinking and speaking, which means that we can start looking critically at the way people talk might index the way they think or the way the ideologies that they are enacting as they speak. 17 emphasizes this knowledge that comes directly from Foucault, that in discourse, power and knowledge are joined together. Meanings do not exist prior to their articulation in language, and language is not an abstract system, but is always socially and historically located in discourse. And it's echoed again by Pennycook in number 18. Discourses do not refer to language or uses of language, but to ways of organizing meaning that are often, though not exclusively, realized in language. So, of course, it is also realized through gestures, through intonation, through paraverbal aspects, through visual, through acoustic, etc. Number 20 by Pennycook adds another dimension to that. The discourses map out what can be said and thought about what they define as their respective domains, which means that in order to understand what somebody is saying, you've got to also understand what that person is not saying. And that is a point that Barbara Johnstone forcefully underlines following Pete Becker, that the silential dimension of language is of paramount importance. What you say in order not to say other things, or what you have not said in order to be able to say what you say, is equally important. And so we've got to look in our data for what was not said in order to say other things. And number 21 is the feminist linguist Chris Whedon, who says to speak is to assume a subject position. In other words, we always have a choice of what to say, what not to say, and how to say it. And our choices index subject positions, the way we position ourselves vis-a-vis others and vis-a-vis invisible prior others or anticipated others. And then finally, I will just take the definition number 23 that you all know by James G., who has given to this all-encompassing definition of discourse, has given it a capital D, and echoing Foucault, although he doesn't quote Foucault, says something like, a discourse is composed of ways of talking, listening, reading, writing, acting, interacting, believing, valuing, and using tools and objects in particular settings and at specific times so as to display or to recognize a particular social identity. So throughout these 23 definitions of discourse, as you can see, we have moved from a rather limited view or linguistically limited view of discourse as textual, structural, to a more post-structural, even postmodernist view of discourse as ways of thinking, ways of valuing, ways of talking and writing that position you in certain ways that are indicative or that index ways in which you think and the ideologies that you reproduce through your speaking or writing habitus. Okay. Now comes the MLA report. Now, you all know the MLA report, and let's read what they want, and in particular what I have highlighted in bold here in light of our discussion of discourse. So what the MLA report advocates is, in fact, that students be taught critical language awareness, interpretation and translation, and historical and political consciousness through language, meaning in language classes. So what we are doing, we are teaching language, but through language we are enjoined to teach historical and political consciousness. Now, seeing what discourse with a big D does, maybe we should be starting to teach discourse rather than just adjectives, nouns, and prepositions. And then, in the end, the report said, our collective mission is of paving the way toward a multilingual future for students in the higher education system in the United States. So what I want to do is to take this mission as expressed by the MLA report with our definition of discourse. So I need to say a few things then in understanding discourse in an era of multilingualism, and I will talk before coming to my concrete example of the textbooks I want to discuss with you. I will discuss shortly discourse under multilingual conditions, the textbook genre, and how history then is entextualized in the textbook genre. So first, how do we understand discourse in an era of multilingualism, and how are we to understand multilingualism? I propose to you the definition that Weber and Horner, Jean-Jacques Weber and Christine Horner, in their recent introduction to multilingualism, they quote Jan Blommert's Sociolinguistics of Globalization, who defines multilingualism as follows. Multilingualism should not be seen as a collection, of languages that a speaker controls, but rather as a complex of specific semiotic resources, some of which belong to a conventionally defined language, while others belong to another language. The resources are concrete accents, language varieties, registers, genres, modalities, such as writing, ways of using language in particular communicative settings and spheres of life, including the ideas people have about such ways of using their language ideologies. So what Weber and Horner and Blommert and many others right now, particularly from sociolinguistics, are proposing is a view of multilingualism that goes beyond just linguistic codes justified one next to another, or just juxtaposed one to another, but multiple linguistic and semiotic repertoires that are enacted through different discourses, very much drawing on Bakhtin's notion of heteroglossia, which is why I have put down there a quote from the introduction to a book that is about to appear by Adrian Blackledge and Angela Crease on heteroglossia as practice and pedagogy. And they say, Heteroglossia is not only, in fact, not principally about the simultaneous use of languages in terms of national linguistic systems, but rather refers to the coexistence of different competing ideological points of view, whether constituted in a single national language or within the complex communicative repertoires in play in super-diverse late modern societies. It is related to three notions: indexicality, tension-filled interaction, and multi-voicedness. In fact, it's interesting that Bakhtin's notion of heteroglossia is translated into French as multilingualism. So it's interesting to operate across different languages. So we have here a definition of multilingualism as multiple repertoires, multilingual styles, multilingual genres, which is basically our mission to alert our students to the variety, the diversity of language uses, which jives with a definition of discourse, in fact, as multiplicity of styles and voices. So I'm going to be focusing on a particular genre, namely the textbook genre, and I'm going to take genre not as definition number one, which is the definition of literary scholars, where a poem, a sonnet, a short story, etc., a kitchen recipe are structural properties of texts. This is a formal definition of genre. I'm going to take a sociolinguistic definition of genre, drawing on the G in the speaking acronym of Delheims as a category or a type of speech act or event, an organizing factor in the speech economy of a community. So by taking the textbook genre as a process of organization of knowledge for the transmission of a certain body of knowledge, in particular foreign language, grammar, and vocabulary, I'm going to be operating on that definition of genre, which allows me to look at the conditions of possibilities and of desirabilities of the textbook genre to teach historical and political consciousness in language classes. And I'm going to jump here, because there's quite a bit of language here on this slide, just to the last one. Genres are conventionalized yet highly flexible ways of organizing communication practice. I want to emphasize for the moment the fact that genres are conventionalized, but at the same time they are flexible ways. They can be re-textualized, re-entextualized, recontextualized, depending on the customers, depending on the country, depending on the needs of the time. In Discourse Genres in a Theory of Practice, the anthropological linguist William Hanks considers genre as an orienting framework for the production and reception of discourse. So genre is not just a formal structure in which discourse sort of fits in. It is an orienting framework on how to understand what we are in the business of doing. For instance, the genre conversation orients the participants in a conversation to understand the kind of bantering, informal chit-chat of the genre. We don't expect that aspect of discourse in a textbook that we expect to be much more rule-governed with boxes and underlined, etc. And I want to read here the one I have bolded up: the historically specific conventions and ideals according to which authors, in Bakhtin's sense of authorship as the production of utterances, compose discourse and audiences to receive it. In this view, genres, again, consist of orienting frameworks, interpretive procedures, and sets of expectations that are not part of discourse structure, but of the ways actors relate to and use language. So when we're going to look at the textbooks that I want to look at with you, we have to factor in the fact that these textbooks were written with an anticipation of particular customers, particular school boards, particular populations of readers and users that correspond to particular ideologies of the people who buy these textbooks, the school districts who order these textbooks, etc. Textbooks don't only present facts, they also echo other texts, and that's where intertextuality comes into play. Intertextuality is the word to denote the presence of elements of other text within a text, which is why when we're going to look at textbooks, we have to look at the echoes of other textbooks in the textbook that we see, and how the textbook that we look at replicate or does not replicate previous generic meaning, previous examples of the genre. That's what expectations of the users are built on. So viewed synchronically, and I'm reading the bold part here, genres enable us to shape discourse into ordered, unified, and bounded text. So we can talk about the entextualization of historical facts, for instance, in textbooks, and viewed diachronically, generic intertextuality enables us to order discourse in historical and social terms. What I will look with you at is how textbooks, in fact, entextualize grammar, vocabulary, and history in different ways. And they are more or less productive way of entextualizing grammar and of entextualizing history, and the two might be in conflict with one another. And then finally, the authority of the textbook. By invoking a particular genre, producers of discourse assert that they possess the authority needed to decontextualize discourse that bears historical and social connections and recontextualize it in the current discursive setting. In other words, we're going to be looking at how these textbooks present historical facts, how they take history out of history textbooks, out of lived histories, memories of and how they intextualize them in the textbook genre, and have the authority to do so because they've got the imprimatur of Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, or Heinley and Heinley in Boston. Okay, so there are five important notions to keep in mind in the analysis that I'm going to do with you. The notion of entextualization and recontextualization, the intertextual gaps, that is, to what extent do the textbooks that we're going to look at conform or don't conform to previous textbooks, time scales, since we're going to be dealing with historic events, on how many different layers of time are we operating. Just to give you an example, when students talk about the invasion of Iraq, for instance, since under George Bush days, we were talking about American foreign policy and the invasion of Iraq. One narrative that kept on coming back under the narration of events in Iraq that you saw in the American press was the liberation of Germany in 1945. The liberation of Iraq from Saddam Hussein was very much, in fact, put in parallel with the liberation of Germany by the victorious American army in 1945. There was a conflation of time scale between 1945 and when was that already? 1990, 95 maybe. Was that? 1991, the first Gulf War, then 1993 or 1994. There was definitely a conflation of narratives that students were reacting to. So we want to be aware of that. I give you an example here that was taken out of an elementary school textbook for German, teaching German in the United States, where they talk about the sisters, the siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were the two members of a movement called the White Rose and represented a reaction and a resistance to the Third Reich. But these textbooks talks about, and I will read the English translation, Hans and Sophie Scholl belonged to the White Rose, a student-resistant group in Munich that since 1942 attempted through anonymous leaflets to call for resistance against the Hitler regime. Now, against the Hitler regime, even said in German, gegen das Hitler-Regime aufzurufen, is an American way of talking about resistance to the Third Reich. In 1942, the Hans and Sophie Scholl would never have talked about the Hitler regime. You have in that phrase, the Hitler regime, an echo of the Pol Pot regime, of the Saddam Hussein regime. You have echoes of other regimes that the United States in its history wanted to liberate people from. So you have here a kind of an anachronistic phrase by calling it the Hitler regime rather than the Third Reich, which is how the sister and brother Scholl would have expressed that at the time, which raises an interesting question of which language, which discourse are you going to use? The discourse that was lived at the time or the discourse now, 50, 60 years later, considering what we know about the regime. But we'll get to that. So let me summarize. Here we have discourse analysis, which up to now has been very useful to help understand communication and communicative activities in spoken and written foreign language, is now used as critical discourse analysis to look at, for instance, textbook genres and to see how, in fact, communicative events in a multilingual world take place and what they say, what they don't say, and how we are to use it to understand how, in fact, in particular textbooks could be written differently to raise historical and political consciousness in a global era. So the research questions that I have posed for the textbooks that I'm going to now be dealing with are three things. How are historical events related to World War II entextualized in German language textbooks? How do the textbooks represent these different time scales and those layered, what Blomert calls layered simultaneities, different meanings on different scales of time? And how do they maximize or minimize gaps between the canonical textbook genre and more progressive or more innovative textbooks that go against the canonical textbook genre? So I'm going to look at two textbooks, intermediate level textbooks. One is to teach American students of German in the US, and it's called Rückblick, looking backwards. And the other one is a textbook in Germany to teach German language through German history to immigrants to Germany. And in both cases, I observed that textbook used by teachers in the classroom with not very positive results, which make it interesting. So Rückblick is a U.S. intermediate level textbooks, and it was published in 1995, together with that other textbook in Germany that was published later, but both draw on historical memories and remembrances of the end of World War II. 1945, as you know, there was the bombing of Dresden on the 13th of February, the bombing of Hiroshima in August 1945. So in 2005, as well as in 1995, in 1995 you had the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima. In 2005 you had the 60th anniversary of the bombing of Dresden. Those two textbooks correspond to these two events and these two commemoration of events. So they are a nice way of looking at how the two different textbooks present historical events. Rückblick has definitely a sense that you teach language through history, that you teach historical consciousness at the intermediate level, teaching both language and historical consciousness. And the second paragraph that you have here says explicitly that you teach history in order for history not to repeat itself. Understanding the lessons of the past assumes a didactic, moral stance. We learn from the past how to behave and how not to behave in the present. So the American intermediate level textbook has definitely a moral, discursive, and didactic position. Erinnerungsorte, which means sites of remembrance, draws on Pierre Nora's lieu de mémoire, undoubtedly, does not look to draw moral lessons from the past, but to understand the past in all its complexity. And in fact, uses, I will just read by translation of the introduction, the connections made between places and memories enable the learners to construct German history through concrete examples on the micro level. Moreover, they can explore the various meanings that these places have acquired over time for various social groups. The learners are thus challenged not to adopt ready-made interpretation schemas or historical models, but to engage with various perspectives on events. Okay, so now let's look at the first textbook, which is your American textbook, published in 1995. Let me remind you that in 1995, at the commemoration of Hiroshima, you must remember the controversy of the view of history from the pilot of the Enola Gay, who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and the provost, Larry Hyman, the chancellor of Berkeley, and I forget his name right now, who was then director of the Smithsonian Institute, who wanted to have an exhibition on nuclear catastrophes and criminal acts, not just Hiroshima, but many others, at the Smithsonian Institute. And you will remember the hoopla between those who had memory on their side, such as the pilot who dropped the bomb, and who absolutely insisted that he would do it again, and who had his own view of Hiroshima, and then the historians who were really quite conflicted with a lot of different perspectives. And that exhibition was withdrawn and never took place because of the controversy about Hiroshima in this country. So the textbook Rückblick and the textbook Rückblick was published just in the middle of that controversy and does not have a word about this whole controversy. The textbook is composed of 7 parts going backwards from 1995 back to 1945 in periods of 6 to 10 years. And to give you a sense of the discourse of that textbook, I will read the last chapter of part 6, and the cultural context. The 50s were a receptive decade in Germany, full of need to catch up and expectations of overcoming the stigma of Nazi past and realigning Germany with European traditions. What I find interesting in that description is that it assumes that the students know the events already, no need to explain them, we all know what happened. So it doesn't say what the Nachholbedarf, the need to catch up with whom, with what. It doesn't explain that, and it seems to assume that the students will understand it because they are Americans and they have the same understanding of history. and expectations and realigning Germany with European traditions. What are European traditions is not explained. It seems like it's part of a narrative of World War II that the Third Reich had, through Hitler, put Germany outside of the European tradition, and now it was coming back into the European tradition, but it's not explained, and certainly not the European tradition. After all, Russia was part of, or the Soviet Union was part of Europe, but it was not obviously considered part of Europe in this particular paragraph. The era was dominated by Cold War hostilities. We don't know how they came about nor why they came about. They just were. The era was dominated, anti-Soviet uprisings, etc. The German Democratic Republic became a dedicated member of the socialist bloc. Things become and emerge. You don't know why. It is assumed, or the only thing we can assume as readers, is that the textbook assumes that the students know why there was a Cold War, or why all of a sudden the Soviet Union became the enemy of the United States, where, in fact, wasn't it the Third Reich? No, it was not the Third Reich. It was, in fact, the Soviet Union. So in West Germany, a conservative democracy emerged based on a free market economy. Things just happen, they emerge, and the word in German is entstand, and so, okay, things entstehen, we don't know why, but all of a sudden there was this miracle economy. It's up to your imagination to find out why. This cultural context is followed by a photograph. You have memorializing the aerial destruction of Rotterdam by the Germans in 1940. Then, interestingly enough, you have a sculpture by in Rotterdam commemorating the bombing of Rotterdam by the Germans, but shortly thereafter you have a poem by Marie-Louise Kaschnitz commemorating Hiroshima. So you have in this chapter an equivalent. I mean, the bombing of Hiroshima seems to be done in tit for tat for the bombing of Rotterdam by the Germans. They are on the same page, they are on the same chapter, and there is a kind of equivalent established in this chapter through equivalences of position within the chapter. There is a Marie-Louise Kaschnitz. The poem is extremely nuanced in how we are to interpret Hiroshima, but not the commentary here that is given. The nuclear explosions of 1945 over Japan were only rarely a topic in literature. The number of victims seemed to preclude any literary treatment. And in her poem, Kaschnitz raises the question of responsibility, and says the poem was written in the mid-50s at a time when the superpowers were testing new atomic and hydrogen bombs almost every year. So the bombing of Hiroshima was only one of many experiments testing the viability and the feasibility of nuclear bombs. So you have the feeling that Hiroshima is not really dealt with itself. It is put in equivalence with other acts equally justifiable. So, as you see, the questions posed after concerning the atomic bomb explosions over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the students are asked, answer the questions when, who, why, and the result, and present a paper. They have to go on the internet. They have to discuss the following question: do you believe, glauben Sie, that the responsibility for modern bombs lies with the physicists, the politician, and the militaries, or that today everyone is responsible for the politics of his or her time? Enormous questions. Do the students have enough vocabulary? We assume that they all know what the answer is, so there's no really much difficulty in vocabulary, but it is striking. And particularly the word glauben Sie in German means, do you think? What do you think? Is it a matter of opinion? What do you think? Is mankind already gotten used to nuclear weapons? What do you think? Pro and contra. That's the kind of thing that is... So, do you believe is a little, how could I say, trivial in that case. Okay. Then comes a poster. Vorsicht, RIAS is the American, the Voice of America in East Berlin, or in Berlin. Vorsicht means caution, caveat, and you see bombs. Gift means poison. So you have poisonous propaganda from America being dropped on East German cities. And you have, this poster serves as a springboard to practice such lexical items as inflammatory speech, inflame, slander to slander, the lies, etc., and asks the students to write an essay for an East German newspaper warning against the danger of American rock music and popular culture. The next part contains a timeline of things exploding, again without any particular subjects of the sentences. And then comes two documents. One is on the occupation zones, but then the document 4 is a poster in English from the American occupation forces in 1947, titled "Germany is at the Crossroads." And here is the poster. It was for the American occupying forces. You have a German with a Bavarian hat here in the corner, is your example guiding them along the right road. You have a crossroad, and in the light you have all that is noble and good: fairness, respect for rights of others, honesty, democracy, peacefulness, a respected nation. And on the left, in the dark side, you have persecution of minorities, resentment of Americans, persecution of minorities, disrespect of U.S. Army, contempt for democracy, black market activities, and an outcast nation. So you have this choice that Americans are saying that Germans should make. Okay, let's go back to the research questions. The discussion of this textbook is: how are historical events contextualized? It does use a historical framework to teach language and culture, and it draws on a variety of modalities. How does it represent layered simultaneities? The history is taught in a synchronized ways that, number one, seem to equate the liberation of Germany in 1945 with subsequent liberation narratives that the American armed forces have had since 1945, so that it's easier for the students to make parallels between American policy after World War II and during World War II. Does it maximize or minimize intertextual gaps? The text provides minimal intertextual gaps, which means it conforms to the canonical genre of normative knowledge that textbooks normally convey. Namely, there is a truth, there is true and false, there is a way of looking at history. You're not shown different perspectives or asked really to take different perspectives, despite the fact that the question to the students are, what do you think? Is bombing somebody to smithereens okay or not okay? Discuss the topic. Excuse my irony here. Okay, now let's look at the second. The second textbook is, in fact, has been written in contradistinction to that. Let me say that the first textbook was very disturbing for one of my TAs, one of my graduate students, who felt that it was coercive, it was propagandistic, etc., etc. And what she did was to take the textbook against the grain and to ask the students to do a discourse analysis of the textbook, which saved the day in the class. This second textbook did not fare too well, but I'll tell you in a different context. So this is done by a series of very enlightened German writers, teachers of German from the Goethe Institute, with the support of the German Academic Exchange Service. And their philosophy is that history is a discursive process of construction of historical meaning. There is no no one right interpretation, but rather learners should be engaged in the process of evaluating and comparing contradictory explanation of events. Original documents give the learner the opportunity to become aware of these documents' foreignness. Learner autonomy and creativity are to be encouraged in the use of materials, and discussion activities offer the opportunity to make multiple links between past historical events and for comparison across different cultures. I'm going to concentrate on the chapter on Dresden. There is a chapter on Berlin and on different cities, but particularly on Dresden, because it was the chapter that I saw taught when I observed that class in Berlin, that was taught to American graduate students learning German in Germany or at the intermediate level. And that lesson bombed, and I will tell you why the American students did not like that lesson at all. Despite the excellent Goethe Institute instructor that I observed in action. So the instructor played first a recording and then had them read this passage from Erich Kästner and his memoir. Erich Kästner, a very famous author, who wrote his memoir when I was a little boy. He himself grew up in Dresden. Dresden was his hometown. And he writes, "If it is true that I not only know what is bad and ugly, but also what is beautiful, then I owe this gift to the luck I had in growing up in Dresden. I did not need to learn from books what beauty is. Yes, Dresden was a beautiful city. You can believe me. Indeed, you must believe me. Not one of you, however rich his father might be, can take the train and go and see if I'm right. For the city of Dresden no longer exists. Except for a few remains, it has disappeared from the surface of the earth. The Second World War, in a single night and by a tiny motion of the hand, wiped it out. Century was spent creating its incomparable beauty. A few hours were enough to magically make it disappear." This happened on the 13th of February 1945. 800 airplanes threw explosive and firebombs, and what remained was a desert with a few gigantic ruins that looked like stranded ocean liners. Now, the teacher asked the students, why did Erich Kästner never name the Americans, since it were the Americans and then, or first the British and then the Americans, that destroyed Dresden? He never asked them. And I asked the teacher afterwards, why didn't you engage them in that? And he said, well, number one, these were American students and I didn't want to embarrass them. Secondly, Erich Kästner was a pacifist. He was definitely a pacifist, but he did not want to name the perpetrators because it would have put him in the camp of the Nazis, who were all too quick to point the finger to the enemy, namely the Americans. So here you have an extremely a dilemma that Erich Kästner, as a pacifist, and of course hated the Americans for what they did to his hometown, but could not lay the blame on them, because by laying the blame on them, he would be put in a camp that he didn't want to be, namely the Third Reich Nazis. And so the silence here that we see in that text is an incredibly complex mixture of political subject position and difficulty of dealing with the after-war situation. So in the text, you have questions for the students. What information does Kästner give his young readers on the bombing of Dresden? Which linguistic details did you notice? What do you think of the way Kästner described the bombing of Dresden? Can you think of legitimate reasons why a war party might destroy a whole city and kill its inhabitants? That was a slightly tendentious question. Do you know of such reasons that were given in past history? Well, I mean, we had just bombed Baghdad. This was in 2007, you know. I mean, and asking that of American students. Now, the students were turned off by these questions and by the discussions because they felt that they were put on the spot, and they felt culture does not have anything to do with a language class. We are here to learn German, not about German history. That's history, that's passé. And being confronted with these questions is debilitating. They felt that being reminded that it was the Americans who had destroyed Dresden was debilitating. So how to commemorate? The book then asks how do you commemorate the bombing of Dresden? And that is the beginning of a debate on memory. Was the bombing of Dresden justified? Now, the students are not really asked to voice their opinion. What do you think? Was it good or was it bad that the Americans bombed Dresden to smithereens? They don't know. They don't have enough information to even entertain this kind of question. So instead, the book gives them text. They show, for instance, a testimony by Dresden and by Victor Klemperer, who also lived under the bombing of Dresden, and two on history. So two on memory and two on history. An interview with Frederick Taylor, a historian who argues that it was necessary to destroy the city, and Harry Mulisch, for whom the whole bombing was just a warning to the Soviets of things to come. So you have, the students are shown on, so you don't need to voice your own expertise or own expert opinion. You can bounce one perspective against the other perspective. And the number 5, should the Frauenkirche, which was the jewel church in Dresden, should it be rebuilt or not? So here you have a very concrete subject position to take vis-à-vis the reconstruction or the non-reconstruction of the Frauenkirche. Two opposite statements are presented, that of the British, who want reconstruction in the name of reconciliation, and that of the American, Kurt Vonnegut, who wants to leave the ruin as a warning against the war. The learners are to discuss the merits of each position. So there again, this textbook fosters perspective-taking, dialogue, and debate. So if we look at my 3 research questions again in that textbook, how are historical events entextualized? Well, obviously, this textbook also draws on historical framework, but here history is presented as co-constructed in dialogue among speakers and between readers and writers. It also draws on a variety of modalities, but it takes a post-structuralist perspective on history as it presents the paradoxes of history. Erich Kästner, who cannot name who bombed his city and who destroyed his city, etc. How can Kästner at the same time hate his government but love his country? That kind of real paradox. Language itself is problematized in that segment. How does the textbook represent layered simultaneity? The text features the larger timescale of the European Union. Now, that textbook was written in 2007 with the European Union, with the Franco-German now Entente, etc., that is still dealing with the legacy of the Cold War clash between capitalism and communism. Does it maximize or minimize intertextual gap? Clearly, it maximizes the intertextual gap between the normative apodictic expectations of the textbook genre and the complex, multi-perspectival, and even paradoxical account of historians. But as I told you before, both texts did not please their customers. The first text did not please the instructor. The second text did not please the American customers. So I find that interesting, and I want to reflect shortly on the approach chosen, because obviously in a time when American students can now go to Germany and learn about German history, but they are confronted with another perspective, another way of looking at historical events. And here our classes are more and more filled with Chinese and Asians coming who themselves have had quite a different understanding of what history is, and we confront them with our American versions of history. There too, there's a clash. So there's a clash clash in genre, there's a clash in discourse processes that I find interesting. So we saw here how the genre textbook play an informational and a didactic role in different modalities. Contexts are synchronized or historicized to various degrees. In fact, there is more or less an overlap of American ideology and the ideology of the time. Remember, the Hitler regime, calling it the Hitler regime, was not the way it was talked about in those days. Intertextual gaps are either minimized or maximized. The text like Rückblick, the first text that minimizes the intertextual gaps, remains quite close to the dominant ideology of a textbook, normative, rule-governed, etc. The second textbook takes pains to maximize the intellectual gap, to make the textbook into a debate, etc., etc., so quite different from the first one. And the textbooks are subject to re-intextualization, manipulation, and change through different exercises. And there are two completely different ways of commemorating, for instance, the bombing of Dresden. Now, globalization and its attendant mobility, that's what I meant with us receiving students from abroad and the increasing multilingualism of our classroom, present a challenge to textbook writers. American students learning German in Germany, foreign students or students from different social backgrounds learning German in the US who use these textbooks are likely to be presented with views of history that are dissonant with the views they are used to from home. These different views are very much linked to their moral view of the world, which is why when we're dealing with history, we're not just dealing with another scientific fact. We're dealing with a view of what it means to be American and what it means to belong to an American nation that is very much linked to the moral view of yourself and your national identity. The structuralist normative nature of the textbook genre conflicts with the post-structuralist view of history that is offered by historians and cultural studies scholars. So that's the dilemma. And then finally, that's my last slide, language textbooks tend to draw on the collective memories of their authors and publishers. They are addressed to readers with similar collective memories. They reflect particular political views, even as they purport to just teach foreign language skills. But what happens when their users don't share their views? Or when public commemorations lead to debates about how to commemorate controversial events? The politics of textbook adoption in the US sometimes lead to mismatches between conservative textbooks and progressive instructors, which was the case with my student teaching the first textbook and being disturbed by it. The globalization of education has made it easier to go and study abroad, but it has made it more difficult to teach historical events. It is true that textbooks are not the end-all and be-all of foreign language education. They can be followed slavishly, selectively, or used against the grain. But as discursive practices, they play an important role in the production and reproduction of ideology and in the shaping of language learners' historical and political consciousness. In an era of multilingualism, American foreign language textbooks will have to find other frames of reference for the representation of historic events, and European textbooks will have to grapple with the demands of global education. These new frames will require a focus on the entextualization and recontextualization of historical events, the maximization of intertextual gaps, and the presentation of what Jan Blommert has called a view both on and from history. What he calls a view from history is the perspective of historians, and the view from history is the perspective of people who have lived through the memory of experiencing that history, and view on history is the view from historians who can have, thanks to the tools of their discipline, have multiple perspective on events. And I think I am done. Thank you very much for your...
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.